The African diaspora is the movement of people from the African motherland to the Americas, including the Caribbean, and then certain cultural practices are brought with them.
But when I think of African diaspora, I think of, well, I go back to the displacement and removal of African peoples and the spread of people from the continent of Africa to other places, including, like, I guess the New World, so like the Americas, the Caribbean. So that's what I think about it. And so I think about, people being removed from their homeland and then brought to a new space, and then the communities that develop in that space. So sort of like a mixing of different, countries in Africa, but also of the indigenous that were in those new places that they're brought to, and then the people who were there colonizing it.
I would define the African diaspora as an entity that consists of different layers in the community. For example, like cultural practices, race, religion, ethnicity, those sorts of things, but within the parameters of Africa.
I think it really refers to the people that left, the people of African descent that are not in Africa. But it also affects the people in Africa, because you can't say, let's say, a couple centuries ago, when someone lost their sister or their brother to the slave trade, you can't say that didn't affect them and that wasn't a change for them. And not only that, but there's always been communication between people of African descent in different locations, whether that's America and Brazil, or America and people of African descent in France, or the motherland itself, Liberia, Ghana, that there's always been this awareness of the diaspora.
When I typically think of African diaspora, I typically think of, them in new spaces and the communities that developed over time in those spaces, and how that shape-shifted. But you can't say that that didn't have an effect on the continent of Africa as a whole, because if people are being removed and then people are still staying there, obviously, there's people in Africa, and so there will always be an exchange between the two, because with them they brought their own cultural, religious beliefs with them, because there's many countries in Africa. So with that, kind of gets integrated. So there'll always be, parts of the African diaspora, in the place where it all began.
I would definitely include Africans in the motherland and the diaspora. So
I never traced my history on my line, but if you look at the people in my family, it's a variety of different tones and shades and experiences. So I think of course somewhere down the line, which I can't really follow, there is parts of me that belong to the African diaspora, because in Puerto Rico there's a mixture. I always say Puerto Ricans are a mixture of European descendants, Taino, and African. So it's somewhere in there, I came along.
I mean, I'm Dominican, so there are strong African roots within the culture, within the food, within the dancing, the music, everything, and the people.
Some people literally only listen to a certain type of music that originated under the African diaspora. Some people like to walk around wearing dashikis. Some people speak some other languages that are spoken within different communities in the African diaspora. So there's a lot of different practices that go on, and so it's hard to kind of give a specific criteria. Plus, everyone's involvement within that entity is different. Some people have a better connection to the African diaspora as others.
I'm Afro-Latino, but there are those people who are there's nothing black about you, you're light and all this other stuff. So it's but then there are also other people who they say that I'm black, and I'm just yeah, I'm Dominican, but I see what you're saying, and I have no problem identifying as being black, but then I feel like that comes with a connotation that you're African American. I know that Latinos, they have this thing when even dark-skinned Latinos are like, I'm not black, I'm Dominican, or I'm Latino, because, blackness is equated with something that's bad, something that's wrong.
The darker you are, the worse predicament you're in all aspects of society, whether that's media, economics, education, or criminal justice.
At the end of the day, regardless if I identify as a woman of color, it's really about people's perceptions of me. And so I've been in spaces where people perceive me as white, or people don't perceive me as white, or people just don't know what I am. So that really affects my social interactions in those spaces. Personally, I feel more comfortable in, I guess you could say, black spaces, just because of how I was raised and who I was raised by and where I was raised. So I think that I always take into account, but I also am very aware of my privileges as being able to pass for white.
It gets very complicated because of the whole slavery and the masters and the whole raping thing and just all that mixing.
But as far as people, who are in America, I don't think that they really had a choice. I think it was forced upon them, and to sort of say that part of that diaspora, belonging somewhere else is kind of difficult, because they have already been colonized for several years, and it's hard for them to become this conscious pariah, like Hannah Arendt says, because they haven't come from a place where they were culturally sort of socializing with these people, or traditionally socializing with a group of people. So I have a hard time sort of identifying someone a part of a diaspora.